If there was anything that could possibly rescue religion in the West, it would be a return to intellectual humility. You have to be certain of this, that, or the other. Then, when you begin feeling doubts or having difficulties with them, that very doubt or that very uncertainty serves as evidence against the truth of the system itself.
Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with a very special guest. We're going to be talking about deconversion. We're talking with someone who studies the topic in school and give us the cutting edge research. So, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
Awesome. All right. Could you give everyone just an intro as far as yourself, what you're working on, why you're interested in this topic?
Sure, absolutely. So, a while back, I got a job as a uh, columnist for a website, and I was writing on Christianity. And one month, I got the idea, hey, why not do a month-long series on atheists that become Christian? Because everybody loves a good, redemption tale, and that's an interesting topic. And it turned out to be an interesting topic because the response it was the best read, best responded, and most republished series that I had ever written. Um, and for years thereafter, I got people talking about it and asking to republish it. So as I wrote these stories, I have a background in psychology. I sort of accidentally got a psychology degree in my undergrad. Long story, but anyway, uh, as I was doing these stories about atheists becoming Christians, I started to notice some recurring uh, themes, right? So I decided to go back to them, break them down statistically, do a case study, and see if I could come up with sort of a model of how an atheist converts to Christianity. Well, as I did that, people are reading my series. They're not all Christians that are reading my series. Some are atheists and they're not real happy about the series for whatever reason. And among the different complaints that I got from that side was, why don't you make it fair and tell all the stories of Christians that become atheists? Well, at the time I was writing a Christian column, it wouldn't have been appropriate for the subject matter, for
Hmm.
my beat, if you will. And so I didn't really give that much consideration until I did the case study and looked at these themes. And then I was really interested on comparing, does deconversion look similar to conversion or are there differences?
Hmm.
So I thought I'd do the same thing. I'd, do a month worth of deconversion stories. And after doing them, look through for themes and see if I could do a comparison. It was an interesting project, nothing big. As I started doing that, I was blown away at the similarities and themes that were emerging from deconversion. So much more crisp and clear than the conversion themes that I could almost, as I'm reading through these stories, I can predict the next thing that's going to happen as the person is telling their story of deconversion. And so that really struck me. And it became more than just a one time story. I started to read the research on it. The first thing that I found was there isn't actually that much research yet on deconversion, far less than there is in conversion. Now, at the time I began this, it was around 2017. At 2019, the Pew reports came out with their survey that's talked about how uh, Christianity is on a rapid decline in the West, whereas atheism is rising. And after that 2019 data was released by Pew Reports, unsurprisingly, a lot of research has emerged in the field of deconversion. And I've been keeping up with it. But I decided, to make that my specialty as I continued looking into it. I was like, lots of writers and things have their specialty. I'm going to be focused on this. As I did, I was like, I came up with a full fledged model for deconversion, stage model of deconversion. And once I did that, I was like, this has to get published. I'm
Hmm.
going to go get my PhD. So I'm working on my PhD in psychology, and my dissertation is going to be on my model of deconversion.
Very, very interesting stuff. Okay, and we'll definitely have to talk about that later. So, specifically, could you give everyone your name, like where you're going to college, and also like YouTube, website, anything like that?
Sure, absolutely. My name's Joel Furches. I'm going to college at Liberty University um, because they're one of the few universities that would allow me to do this dissertation, this specific dissertation. Um, as far as websites in YouTube, I do a channel called Switching Sides in which I talk about my research. So that would be a good place to go
Mhm.
for finding me. Otherwise, my name's Joel Furches. You can find me on all the social medias just by searching my name. I am actually the only Joel Furches online that exists. I've checked. It's an unusual set of first and last names.
Uh, well, that'll make things easy for everyone. But yeah, everyone go check out his channel. He posts a lot of Joel posts a lot of videos on the deconversion and analyzing other YouTubers, atheists, and their responses are really interesting. I've learned a lot, and a lot of the stuff is just really fascinating. We're going to be talking about a lot of that today. So
Yeah, I forgot. I
yeah,
also do a column for Patheos called Switching Sides, where I publish weekly on my research. So
okay,
it's another good
yeah,
place to find me.
cool. All that'll be in the description. So. Question for you. How would you define deconversion?
Deconversion, for the purposes of my research, deconversion is when a person goes, transitions from identifying publicly as a Christian. What's your religion? I'm a Christian. All right. So they're not afraid to put that identity out there. They identify as a Christian and ends up identifying as some form of irreligious, whether it be humanist, atheist, agnostic. There's a bushel of terms that people will use to identify themselves there, but they all stand in opposition to the idea of religion.
Okay, okay. And is that different than deconstruction? How would you define the difference there?
So, deconstruction is a pop term and it's borrowed from postmodern philosophy. If you read the research in this field of psychology on the subject, the term deconstruction doesn't ever appear at all.
Hmm. Okay.
You might, like, early studies use the term apostasy, but currently the term used in all the research I'm reading is deconversion.
Okay.
Um, because deconstruction, again, it's borrowed from the field of philosophy and it's not something psychologists would run to in order to adopt philosophical language. It's kind of a pop term, so it's sort of gotten uh, cultural baggage associated with
Mm.
it. And so,
Yeah.
if you're talking about deconstruction, you're really talking about a sort of personal journey kind of thing.
Mm.
And yeah, it's not a term I would use.
Very interesting. Okay. So obviously you've done a lot of work on the topic of deconversion. Can you give us a little info on where you got this information from? Like what information did you look at in your case studies? Like did you talk to specific people? How did you gather your data?
All right, so because I began this from this whole process as a journalist and not as a psychologist, I did the
Mm,
same thing that I did when I was studying conversion of atheist. I looked online. I looked for blog posts. I looked for YouTube channels. I looked for
mm,
books that had been published. I'd looked for, anybody who expressed their story about
mm,
moving from Christianity to atheism. Now, again, because I was approaching it as a journalist, I tried to find sources of people that had talked about it more than once so that I can compare their tellings of their story, you know, multi-source the story, try to get their retellings to pick out the themes that emerged. Um, and so most of the people that you'll find in my research are relatively well-known names. Like Bart
mm,
Ehrman would be one that's fairly recognizable. And he's told his story often enough, and in enough channels that I was able to multi-source and pull the data and themes from his telling and retelling. So
mm,
that's where I got that information. After I began to write on the subject, I have talked to people about their deconversions, but
mm,
ordinarily I don't enter that data into my study because uh, those data come from casual conversations. They're not being recorded. I'm not writing notes, so
Hmm.
I'd have to do it from recall. Um, and it's better to have it in front of me when I do the coding.
That makes sense. Okay, and so you've detailed like a 5-step model of some type of how deconversion happens. Uh, Maybe you can clarify what that is, what the purpose of it is, and maybe get into some of the steps.
Sure, absolutely. So the 5 stage model that I came up with was stage model is probably not the right word for it. It's more like a vector model, which I mean you can trace where a person is on the process through this model. The difficulty with stage models is that you can read your experiences into the stage model and say, "Oh yeah, this totally talks about me," in much the way that your horoscope would or other things. So the difference with a vector model is that it says that you're at this stage, so or in this proximity in your journey. So the beginning of that would be simply um, the setting conditions, um, which is the more accurate term for that would be establishing operations. All right. So establishing operations is a term that comes from specifically behavioral psychology. And establishing operations basically speaks to what in, increases the probability of the behavior. So, for instance, um, if you're sitting around in a hot room and there's a cold glass of water there, the heat of the room is the establishing operation, which would increase the probability of you taking a drink of water. So, establishing operations, I'm looking at what are these features in the religious experience, in the religious background and environment, which increase the probability of the person exiting that environment. Right. So, as I went through the various biographies that I went through, I pulled out 5 different establishing operations, 5 different setting conditions that were very commonly seen in the religious background of these people. Would you like me to go through all 5 of those?
Sure, go for it.
All right. So the first one is performance control. Now, performance control speaks to the way in which your environment controls your behavior. So in this case, we're talking about the social environment. Um, in a religious setting, there are certain standards that the people in that setting have for behaviors. So there are certain behaviors they're going to reward with, you know, praise, attention, um, accolades, invitations to speak, that kind of thing. So the person's really going to want to behave that way if they want approval in that environment. And then there are other behaviors that elicit disapproval. And so those disapprovals might be as minor as people whispering behind your back or giving you a side look because they know you did a thing, or might be as major as the church kind of pulling you aside and telling you to leave the church because of the way you're behaving or something like that.
Hmm.
So, but anything on that scale is uncomfortable, right? Because you've got people disapproving of you. And the interesting thing about that is that you yourself, as part of that environment, are also contributing to this behavioral control because you're also judging other people in the way that they act uh, and are consistent with the standards of the religious environment. So,
Hmm.
different religious environments are more like that than others. I'm sure that all religions have some kind of standard, and so very few of them are going to let you pass with murder. But, it could be more minuscule behaviors that they get
Hmm.
judgmental about depending on the environment.
Hmm.
Like you're showing a little ankle that's a little too much skin, to use a extreme. So
Sure.
behavior control or performance control is the first thing I noticed. Um, Textualism is the second one. Textualism is a legal term meaning that you're abiding by the letter of the law without reading anything between the lines. In this case, I'm using the term to describe how a person treats the holy text. In the case of Christianity, the Bible. Um, Different churches treat the Bible differently, and the close, the extreme textualism would be something like the words in the Bible were written directly by God, directly to you as an individual. Um, it's so inspired that a little girl in Russia could pick it up and get the exact same meaning out of the text that a little boy in uh, 10th century BCE would get reading the Hebrew scriptures,
Hmm.
you know, so that there's no cultural nuance or anything, background knowledge that needs to be there in order to understand it. It has to be that inspired, which means that these little details that might be inconsistent, these little arguments, are more severe in their nature. I mean, if you're a little more relaxed in the way that you treat the Bible, when two people argue about it, it's not going to be particularly surprising because it's text. People argue about what the meanings of things. But if you believe that the Bible is like the literal voice of God speaking off the page to
Hmm.
everyone, disagreement, it should be surprising to you, because why would you disagree on something that's clear, right?
Hmm. Sure.
Um, so yeah, the textualism, and of course that there are levels of textualism, but
Hmm.
basically the idea of infallibility can be problematic when flaws are brought to your attention in the
Hmm.
Bible, right?
Interesting. Question for you. So
Yeah.
on that legalism, performance control idea, on your article you sent me, you said there is a heavy pressure to perform, and there is a consequence of shame or guilt if you fail. There's a question for you, and that's okay if you don't have a specific answer for it. I'm curious why you would think, or if you've ever thought about it much, why you would think that that would promote deconverting. Like, why would this idea of control and shame and guilt promote deconverting?
Well, it's fairly simple. I come from, my work in psychology began with behaviorism.
Hmm.
And behaviorism states that anything you do has one of five motivations to it. Um, and among those five motivations is escaping from negative, from aversion,
Hmm.
aversive stimuli. So if you turn on the fan in the room, you're probably trying to escape the aversive stimuli of the heat, the discomfort of being
Hmm.
hot. If you run out of your classroom into the bathroom, probably you did that because there was an aversive feeling in your bladder that motivated that behavior. And in
Hmm.
this case, the environment within the church is aversive, and whereas the environment outside of the church is more comfortable.
Hmm. So it's as
So
simple as people feel bad and therefore they're going to leave the church,
yeah,
right?
people are going behavior flows away from punishment and towards reward.
Hmm.
So if the environment itself is punishing,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
an environment outside of that, let's say that this is the stereotype: you go to college, you make a bunch of college friends, you leave your religion behind.
Hmm.
There might be some truth to that insofar as you go off to college, and if all your friends are not Christians and they tend to be more accepting of you and your behavior than your Christian friends, then that's a
Hmm.
much more comfortable environment to be in than the church.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how simple that is. So, what about textualism? So, sticking to the letter of the law, but also, like, I guess a good way to put it is like a more literalistic view of the Bible and
Sure.
inspiration.
Yeah.
So I guess that's more a little more obvious. I guess well, I guess in some ways it's like, well, why wouldn't they just change their view of the Bible? But um, instead of like just going all the way to deconverting. So why do you think that promotes some type of deconverting?
Well, first of all, yes, people do change their views in order to
Hmm.
escape the in this okay with textualism. You're
Yeah.
taught that the Bible is infallible and there's no problems with XYZ. You run
Hmm.
into a problem. Now, if you weren't taught that, if your feelings on the Bible were it's a book of literature or something like that, and somebody
Hmm.
says, well, they got the name of the emperor in the first century wrong, You'd be like, ah, well, it's a piece of literature. Literature
Yeah.
has flaws. But if you are taught that that's a thing that can't happen, then that becomes a much bigger deal than if you weren't taught that, you didn't
Mm,
believe that.
mm,
And so the more committed you are to this idea that the Bible is inerrant, the more damaging errors are when they're brought to your attention.
mm,
And so, um, and this is specifically works. It's interesting to me because, believe it or not, objections to the Bible are the number one objection in terms of frequency that I've been able to note from deconverts. You know,
mm,
deconverts, they'll tell you a lot of things that were objections they had as they moved away from their belief, right? But of the many things that they say, the most frequent one has to do with problems with the Bible. Now, looked at logically, if the Bible is perhaps 100% wrong, how do you leap from there to say that there is no such thing as a God? You know, that
mm.
doesn't seem to follow. You know, at best, it disproves one kind of God.
Yeah, sure.
But why would you jump to the idea that there is no God? Well, when your church environment tells you that either the Bible is true or God doesn't exist, they've put
Mm,
a binary choice in front of you. And when you decide the one thing isn't true, obviously the other must be. You know, the
mm,
church has kind of narrowed that path down that it's either total unerrant, inerrant scripture or nothing. You
mm,
know, I mean, it works more like this because the church will say, you know, Christianity is true or nothing is true. The church really doesn't leave the third option on the table. Hey, Islam, yeah, maybe that's an option. I don't know, because no, it's the church for whatever reason places itself up against atheism as those are the two standards.
mm,
It's us or nothing, and
mm,
so when it's not us, it must be nothing.
mm,
So, you know, scriptural problems become much more uncomfortable, and that discomfort is what we call
mm,
cognitive dissonance. And
mm,
cognitive dissonance simply refers to the uncomfortable feeling when you're holding two things in your brain
mm,
which conflict with each other, you know. And so the Bible is inerrant, but there's problems with the Bible. That causes cognitive dissonance, which is a discomfort. And we jump back to the first thing we were talking about, aversion, right? You've got this aversion in your life, it's a discomfort. The best way to get rid of it is to
Yep.
dismiss one or the other of those.
Mm,
And if you can't find a way to reconcile this problem with the Bible, you go the other way and say, well, the Bible's untrue. Now,
mm,
like you said, it could be that could mean just moving to a form of Christianity which doesn't hold such a wooden view of literalism. And
mm,
frequently that does happen. And many times people stop there and don't progress down the line. But the interesting thing about deconversion is that, as far as I've been able to tell, deconverts always come from a very rigid form of Christian belief. Um, Perhaps the term that would be most associated with that would be fundamentalism, right?
mm,
You've got this, and that is fundamentalism in my definition is distinguished by the amount of certainty that it demands from the people who hold it, you know. So that total fundamentalism means you need to be 100% certain about everything that the church has told you or that you believe. If there's any uncertainty whatsoever, then it can't be true.
mm,
So it demands a high level of certainty, a high level of confidence. And when it demands that much confidence and you leave that and you transition to another form of religion, that demand for confidence didn't go away. You're creating more um, cognitive dissonance for yourself because
mm,
you've moved into a system with less certainty.
mm,
And as you continue to move away from the fundamentalism to try to resolve these beliefs, more uncertainties arise until the entire thing must not be true.
mm.
So whenever you're
Yeah.
comparing your objections to your current religion, the objections are really being compared to your original belief structure. Not where you're at right now, but where you were. And as those objections mount against each other, religion seems less and less probable because you're always comparing it to where you started.
So have you done much hypothesizing on how that whole certainty idea like starts, as well as how it works out, as you continue? Because, you know, realistically speaking, I have no issue with saying like, okay, this thing has like a 50% chance of happening. This also has another 50% chance of happening. I'm perfectly okay with that. I was never grown up in that, and in this idea of you have to have certainty about things. But at the same time, plenty of people have that issue,
Hmm.
or issue, however you want to describe it. But why does it? Is it just like, continually being told that you just have to have certainty in something, and is it that simple, or is it a lot of different factors that come into that?
Well, it's an interesting question
Uh-huh.
because in the book How Minds Change, and I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, so apologies for that. But the um, he discusses two different very effective systems for getting people to change their minds. And
Okay.
when I talk about people, I'm talking about random people that the person pulls off the street, somebody who's been trained in this system.
Hmm.
One of them is very familiar to the world of Christian atheist conflict, and that is street epistemology. Now,
Huh.
street epistemology works pretty much like this. And by the way, street epistemology began as a sort of deconversion strategy for atheists.
Hmm.
Uh, as it continued to develop, there's a person who has a streaming channel and makes quite a bit of money on a streaming channel using street epistemology just to talk people out of anything. He'll grab a person and say, all right, what's something you truly believe in? Aliens built the pyramids, something, flat earth, anything really. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter what the claim they make. It could be a perfectly reasonable claim. He'll then walk them through the steps of street epistemology so that they walk away from there having been talked out of that belief. So street
Hmm.
epistemology at ground level is just a way of getting a person to doubt a belief so severely they no longer
Hmm.
hold it. And so this is how it works. You establish the claim God exists. All right, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that that is true? Okay? All right, so I'll say, no, it's 8. 8. And he'll say, all right, so 8. Why not 10? What's keeping you from being at 10? Now, where are you losing those 2 points? There must be some doubt somewhere against it. And then you explain your doubts, and he'll ask you to expand on that. And by the end, you've talked yourself out of your belief. Or if you say, oh, 10, absolutely. He'll say, oh, that's a lot of certainty. How would you justify that certainty? Where do you go to make sure that you're so absolutely certain there can't be a single doubt in your mind?
Hmm.
And as you continue to justify your certainty, he'll pick holes in your little justifications until you go down the scale because he'll continue to revisit it. Okay, so now, right it now, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you say? 7. Oh, okay. So why not 10? You know, at a base level, it's not a difficult technique,
uh,
but there's certain methods to it. The second technique uses a very similar approach, but this is a technique to talk somebody into something a belief they currently don't hold.
mm,
And in this one's called, the name will have to come back to me. Deep canvassing. That's called deep canvassing. So in deep canvassing, you would walk up to a person and ask their opinion on a subject. Now, this is almost exclusively done in the realm of politics. So ask them their, uh, let's say, something innocuous like gas tax. Should the government tax
there you go.
gas? All right. So they'll say, no, I don't think so. All right. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that? And you would go 8, I guess. And instead, at this point of doing the thing where you start poking holes, you start asking them their story. Like, tell us your story about this. How has your journey brought you to this decision about gas? And so you'll tell your story and they're like, oh, and they'll pay attention and they'll ask for, and then they'll share an opposite point of view, but not facts about it. Share a story about it. How this is, that gas station or that gas tax before it was enacted, the country was far more run down. These poor women were on the streets. Here, let's listen to a story of one of these, and then it'll show how that gas tax money is going towards social welfare and things like that. And as the stories mount up and become more emotional and you get that personal connection, then you've talked them into that position by way of narrative, by way of story,
Hmm.
not fact, story. So
Interesting.
in both instances, in both of these really tested and proven ways of talking a person out of or into a position, it always comes back to the scale of certainty. Throughout the conversation, you revisit the scale. All right, where are you now on a scale of 1 to 10? Have you moved up? Have you moved down? Where are you at? And they'll hit you with that. And it's that certainty angle that really drives the change of mind. And this isn't just in Christians. This is in people on political issues. This is people on, beliefs about 9/11 was an inside job, anything.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know what it is about human beings and certainty, but I guess the things that we have deep conviction about,
Uh,
we believe we must hold those convictions with some level of certainty.
yeah. Yeah. That got really deep just now. Interesting. Okay. So, I kind of cut you off there. Isolationism. Tell me about that.
Okay, so isolationism is the most common factor that I found in these stories. And that's basically where you pull the person, you're like, all right, we're in a Christian bubble here. Kind of keep everything inside. Don't let your arms and legs get outside of the cart. You know, um, you got to modify the media that they have access to. So let's watch some Veggie Tales instead of um, whatever kids watch these days. uh, yeah, whatever the latest show is, Veggie Tales.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm either. But yeah, so
Cocomelon.
there you go. Instead of Coco Melon, Veggie Tales. Uh, and kind of keep them from forming close friendships or relationships outside of their church. Sort of tr- isolate the person within this environment. So it's
Mhm.
sort of a hyper tribalism, right? Because everybody outside of my group is kind of an outsider. Now, that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that Christians are necessarily standing around saying that everybody outside of uh, our church is going to hell or is a bad person or anything like that. Christians tend to have a higher level um, of concern. I don't know. I don't know what the word is, charity, I suppose, towards people outside. But at the same time, the confidence plays back in, right? We're right, they're wrong.
Mhm.
Therefore, kind of keep inside here. And therefore, when a person kind of goes, again, I'll use the example going off to college. You're meeting people who are sharing views that you've never encountered before. And there's a lot of research that suggests that once you get exposed to these new views, now that's not to say, like, all right, we'll take evolution as an example. Somebody
Okay.
who's in a church environment which states that evolution is opposed to biblical truth
Mhm.
um, won't necessarily say, so don't ever study the issue of evolution. They'll probably give you a very modified version of the theory of evolution that kind of fits these presuppositions. And that's called a straw man, right? So everything you know about evolution comes from the sources that don't agree with it. Then you go off to college and you start hearing about evolution from somebody who actually believes that's the truth. And you
Mhm.
get the Steelman version, which is the strongest version of that argument that could possibly be. And when you
Mhm.
compare it against what you've heard within your insular environment of the church, you say, well, this isn't what they told me at all. This is completely different. And so the Christian version starts to sound a lot less convincing. Um, Now, take something else, like um, say Islam. You don't know much about Islam in the church because you're in this insular environment. You've heard, a thing or two about terrorists, maybe, but
Mm-hmm.
that's all the exposure you have. And then you go off to college. Your roommate is a Muslim, and suddenly you start to realize, hey, they're not that bad of people. They're kind of nice. And then you run into a difficulty because you've been taught that everyone who's not a Christian is going to hell and is evil in your insular Christian environment. Now you've run up to a person who seems perfectly nice and who you can't imagine them, being evil or going to hell. And suddenly the exclusivism of Christianity, which says you're either in or out,
Mm-hmm.
um, seems very uncomfortable. And so you have to start modifying your way of looking at the world to allow for other very nice people who aren't Christians to get in. And that, again, doesn't match with what you've learned and what you've been told your whole life.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, you. Okay, I think we've already talked about this compulsive certainty.
Yeah, I should have written that compulsory certainty,
Okay.
um, because that's what I meant. Compulsory
Uh,
certainty, meaning that you're sort of required to be certain by your environment.
mm. All right. Cool. 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 All right.
And
So
then
what
we
about
didn't do
stressors?
spiritualism.
Oh, did I skip one? Shoot.
Yeah,
Yeah,
spiritualism.
spiritualism. What do you got for me?
Spiritualism is interesting because and what I found when I was doing the survey and gathering
Mm-hmm.
data from all of these different deconversion stories that I looked at was the two most common churches for deconversions to occur from. This is statistically significant, which doesn't mean it's the largest. Like, you attend this church, you're definitely going to deconvert or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But the two most common were charismatic, um, meaning like Pentecostals, uh, or Catholic. And
Really?
I'm like, really, what do those two have in common? They seem very, very different from one another.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing they have in common is that they both sort of emphasize this life of the spirit, this idea that the world is operated um, from a very supernatural, in a very supernatural way.
Hmm.
You know, there's angels and demons around every corner. In a Catholic church, you don't go and then convulse on the floor, saying that you've been struck by the spirit or whatnot. But Catholic churches and Catholic practices are kind of tailored to a certain level of the divine is in everything. I mean, think about the Eucharist in Catholicism. That
Yeah.
wine and bread are absolutely, definitely transforming into literal flesh and blood. Um, and so there's a certain supernaturalism built into those systems. Now, you might go to another kind of church which would say that, I mean, the ordinary world is more or less ordinary. We're not going to say that God never intervenes,
Mm-hmm.
but what science says about how the world operates is more or less all there is. It's take the world at face value, and religion deals more with the spirit, with our connection with God,
Mm-hmm.
the hereafter or whatnot. So those churches which operate on a much more all bad things are demons working in your life, and all good things are angels standing around you, kind of. And again, I may be exaggerating, but not
Yeah.
always.
Yeah.
When they tend towards the supernatural, that tends to be problematic later on in two ways. The first way is that as one matures and kind of moves out into the world, that view becomes more difficult to hold because the world seems sort of very ordinary, face value, materialistic at face value. And
Mm-hmm.
secondly, as you sort of get involved with things like the study of science, supernaturalism begins to seem kind of ridiculous. And you kind of have to draw back from that position. Now, another way in which this becomes problematic is that if everything that happens in the world is the direct hand of God or an angel or a demon, and I'm having a very difficult life, and I keep praying to God and nothing
Mm.
happens,
Yeah.
where is that miracle I've always been told would be waiting around the corner?
Hmm.
Where are all the miracles in the world? You know, well, either it's not true or God just hates me. And that completes the five religious conditions that I noticed in my study.
Yeah. So all those would you say just the most popular ones that just really stood out among all of them, or just a big majority, or what?
Well, when you take the five performance control, textualism, isolationism, spiritualism, and compulsory certainty,
Hmm.
it's very difficult to find objections against Christianity that can't be lumped into one of those categories,
Hmm.
or at
Okay.
least the dark face of those categories, because these categories build what I have called in my next stage um, the pressure or the stressors. So just cycling back through, and we've talked
Hmm.
about the stressors associated with spiritualism. Um, we've compulsory certainty. We kind of touched on that when I was talking about the methods of talking a person out of
Hmm.
a position. But compulsory certainty is when you're told that you have to be certain that if you die you're going to wake up in heaven, that you have to be certain of the truth of the Bible, you have to be certain of this, that, or the other. Then when you begin feeling doubts or having difficulties with them, that very doubt or that very uncertainty serves as evidence against the truth of the system itself.
Oh. Hmm.
You know, if you're allowed a little latitude in terms of intellectual humility, meaning that you recognize that you've got limitations on your ability to understand things and there are just some
Hmm.
things you can't know, um, then it's not as uncomfortable when you have doubts or problems because, hey, that's to be expected. I'm just human.
Hmm.
But when you're told that the spirit is dwelling within you and that all things must be certain to you, or else the spirit's not as in you as it ought to be, um,
Yeah.
then that becomes uncomfortable. So then with performance control, we talked about how that can become a stressor. uh, with textualism. Yeah, with textualism, when you have to be so certain of the truth, I'm sorry, the infallibility, the absolutism of Scripture, any
Hmm.
little problem with Scripture, which might be a curiosity or a motivation to kind of look into things, study more, for someone who doesn't have that kind of wooden literalism.
Hmm.
Uh, for somebody who does have that kind of wooden literalism, it's evidence that their entire system is damaged.
Hmm.
So that becomes a stressor.
Hmm.
Um, I think that more or less goes through all of the ways in which all of these five factors can become stressors.
Hmm.
All right. So this stress is building up in your life from
Hmm.
various spiritual problems, but you've got something holding you back from actually looking into those difficulties, asking those questions, and exploring your doubts. Um, and that's what I call the preventative principle. The preventative principle is whatever keeps you from actually exploring your doubts, asking the questions, and going into the deconstruction, if you will. And the preventative principle could be a number of things. For instance, one of the deconverts that I studied was a philosophy major at some Christian college, I believe. And as he's studying philosophy, he's coming up with more and more questions and concerns with his religion. But he does notice that all of his fellow philosophy majors are still very firm and confident, and hey, they're hearing all the same stuff he has. He is. So at that point, he's not asking those questions. He's not really exploring those doubts because of the confidence of the people around him. If they can be confident, and I'm sure they know more than I do, I can be confident too. Why not?
Hmm.
But when those people started verbally asking the same questions he had on his mind, bam, he was ready to go. He was ready to ask those questions, explore
Hmm.
those doubts, and transition into deconversion. Um, Another example from my study, it was she was the daughter of the guy who runs CARM, the Christian Apologetics Resource Ministry. Um, but at any rate, the point is, she came from a family where apologetics was a
Matt
big deal.
Slick.
Yeah, Matt Slick, his daughter Rachel, um, who had grown up under his tutelage, if you will, and
Mm.
from her father, she had gotten this concept that all questions had an answer. Right, so if there was a question against Christianity, an objection against Christianity, it had an
Mm.
answer. And so the stressor in her life, and this is, I'm pulling this directly from an article she wrote about her deconversion. So nothing I'm saying here is, um, spilling tea or anything. Uh, she was in college. I don't know if her college was Christian or not because I don't recall that detail from the article. But
Mm.
she began dating this guy, and she was um, becoming intimate with him. And when she did that, because it went against her Christian upbringing, she felt uncomfortable, obviously. She felt as if she was sinning. So there's this building pressure that, of guilt, but she's got this preventative principle of apologetics. Every question has its answer. And then one day she's walking along the campus talking to a friend, and she comes up with a question against Christianity that she is certain has no answer. Now, as soon as she was able to find a question that didn't have an answer, it removed that preventative principle, and she was able to then start asking all of those questions
Mm.
and um, transitioning into the deconversion.
Mm.
So, yeah, that's the preventative principle. It's whatever principle is keeping you from giving yourself permission to ask those questions and to transition into the deconversion.
So, just for clarity's sake, is this where we get next to the trigger? So the trigger takes them out of their preventative principle, or how do
Yeah,
they get out of that?
the trigger is what removes the preventative principle.
Okay, gotcha,
Um,
gotcha, gotcha.
so, in the two instances that I talked about,
Hmm.
one, the first guy, the trigger was when his friends at the Christian college began asking these philosophical questions or raising these doubts against um, Christianity. Now,
Hmm.
suddenly, his confidence was sustained by their confidence. Their confidence is gone. His preventative principle is gone. Now he can verbally ask the questions that have been
Hmm.
hovering in his mind.
Yeah.
With Rachel Slick, her preventative principle was this idea that uh, apologetics could handle all objections.
Hmm.
And when she found an objection that apologetics couldn't handle, that principle was removed and she was allowed to start asking those questions.
All right. Okay. So what next? We have the process.
So the process is what would probably, that's the closest thing in my model to the deconstruction uh, term. And this is the part that everybody focuses on. Once you get into the process, and in this case, think of it as a computer process. You're processing, you're computing data, you're moving things around. Um, and that in itself tends to be the most studied part of this because all of the things that I just mentioned are preconditions leading up to the processing, asking these questions, voicing these doubts, finding they have no solution. Now I've noticed that these tend to go in two directions. You've got those people who don't really want to deconvert. They prefer to preserve their religious belief, and so these are the people who start digging into apologetics. These are the people who start, raising these questions around other Christians to see if they can possibly get answers.
Hmm.
Um, and they really struggle with losing their belief. Then you've got other people who actually are excited to escape the religion. And so now that they've entered the processing, it's actually an exhilaration for them because they get to ask those questions, they get to dismantle these things, and this kind of escapes them from the prison that their religion has been to them.
Hmm.
Um, so you've got the rescuers who are dragged out of the door to kicking and screaming, if you will, And then you've got the deconstructors who are tearing the bricks of their religion out very enthusiastically to try to escape it.
Mm. And then true deconstruction. Did you talk about that?
So yes, that was the people who are eagerly
Gotcha.
trying to
Gotcha.
get
Gotcha.
out.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of how this works, though. There's a study, probably my favorite titled study that I've ever encountered. It was titled "She's Hot, but She's a Little Crazy," and in this study, they were looking at an interview between an interviewer and Katy Perry, the pop star, and then an interviewer and Meg. She starred in Transformers. What's her name?
Megan Fox.
Megan Fox. Thank you. So both of those women grew up in sort of charismatic religious backgrounds. Um,
Okay.
and both of them left those backgrounds. They both deconverted. Um, when the interviewer was talking to Katy Perry about her deconversion, about leaving religion, Katy Perry was, spoke about her exit from religion in a term of, sort of religion had all of these bad effects on me. There were bad things about religion, and now I'm free from those bad things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a relief, it's a triumph,
Yeah.
I've moved to a better place in my life. Megan Fox, when she was talking about it, she talked about, how she exited different various life circumstances that brought her to a point where she no longer believed. But then she kind of reminisced about religion and all of the things about it which were good and that she missed. Now, when the interviewer finished the interview with Katy Perry, who was happy to be out of religion, um, she was seen as a normal and very stable individual. When Megan Fox was talking about her deconversion experience and how, she kind of missed certain things about religion, you know, there were regrets about leaving it. That was the article that was titled "She's Hot, but She's a Little Crazy," because, the fact that she presented as a person which was sympathetic to religion and missed some things about her religion uh, was seen as kind of weird or bizarre from a public perspective.
Hmm.
Why would you miss that? So,
Yeah.
in that study, I mean, the study was titled after the article that it was talking about, but it was interesting that the public perception is much more sympathetic to the person who is relieved to have gotten out of religion and less sympathetic for the person who misses something about religion.
Yeah. That is weird. Okay. What about deconversion, matter of commitment, deconversion crisis? What do you have to say about that?
Sure. So when I'm talking about a matter of commitment, there are a lot of people who step out of religion. They leave religion. And most of those people end up ticking the box that says none when they're asked their religious affiliation. You know, religious affiliation, you can be Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu.
Mm-hmm.
You could be atheist, agnostic, or you could be none. And these people will leave religion and they'll tick the none box. Now, what's the difference between that person and the person who ticks the atheist box? I mean, they both left religion. What factors cause the one to tick atheist and the other to tick none?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you tick none, you're really not committing to any sort of opinion about religion. You're not religious. You're not saying religion is wrong. You're not saying religion is right. You're basically saying you have no opinion on the matter.
Yeah.
You've exited religion and you've put that behind you, and it's not a thing that is important or meaningful in any way. The person who ticks atheist actually holds a theological position, if by theological you mean they make statements about the nature of God and the nature of religion.
Yep.
And an atheist will definitely have things to say about what God is like and what religion is like, and usually not very flattering things. But the point is that they've committed much more strongly in their position than the person that ticks the none box. Well, the people who tell these deconversion stories, and I say this in the opening of the article you're referring to, are people who were very committed when they were in the religion. These
Mm-hmm.
are people who are often involved in ministry in some respect, or if not involved in ministry, they made Christianity very central to their identity. So when they exit the religion, there's an identity crisis that occurs. If I'm not
Mm-hmm.
Christian, what am I?
Yeah.
Um, and the people who tick the nun box, they tend not to have been as committed. They didn't make their religion as central to their identity, and therefore, when they left religion,
Mm-hmm.
they just migrated to a different identity. Something that they already had, um, and it was just a insignificant piece of baggage that they shed from their lives, um, or trivial piece of baggage, and so it wasn't as big a deal. But the person who leaves and then becomes atheist, that's a huge transition. So they come from a point of great commitment to the religious identity to a
Mm-hmm.
point of ticking a very committed box on the survey against religion. Um, so there's an identity crisis, which is the deconversion crisis
Mm-hmm.
to which you alluded. Now, this is where I would return to the um, issues such as church hurt or religious trauma syndrome that you hear a great deal about. I have not studied the literature on that because, frankly, there's not that much
Right.
literature to study. Most of what's been written on that has been written not from a research perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
more from a biographical perspective, from a self help perspective, from
Yep.
different things like that. There are one or two studies out there now, um, that actually do speak about the rising language of the term religious trauma syndrome, how this has sort of entered the public vernacular. But I haven't seen anything that I can access through the research libraries that I have access to through my college that are significant studies on this idea of religious trauma syndrome. But what you do see is that when a person exits the religion, they have the identity crisis I just told you about. Christianity was very central to their identity. Now they need to form a new identity. That's a pretty traumatic thing to go through. To really, especially when it's later in life. If you're a teenager and you deconvert, which is, by the way, the age at which most deconversions happen,
Mm-hmm.
um, you're just forming your adult identity. You're moving away from childhood into adulthood, and these are not the people who are making YouTube videos and writing their biographies about deconversion. The people who are doing that tend to deconvert during adulthood, like full adulthood, usually middle age, believe it or not. But um, yeah, there's an identity crisis there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, who am I now?
Yeah.
And those are traumatic. Worse than that, possibly, is the loss of community. Christianity was central to your identity, so your Christian community was your community. We talked about isolationism. This is what kind of the people you grew up with. These are the people that were your closest friends. And suddenly you're not part of the tribe anymore. So they have an identity crisis to go through themselves. If he's not one of us, who is he? How do we transition from this person we really liked, who we broke bread with and we spent time
Mm-hmm.
with, um, who we identified as being a brother in Christ, but he's not. Who is he now? And so there's this loss of community. There's this sort of feeling of rejection, and there's not sufficient communities to replace it. I mean, we're building towards that. I recently did a broadcast together with a humanist. What is he? Chaplain, a humanist chaplain in England. And England's much further along the line of secularization than America is. And so, to find a humanist chaplain or a humanist organization you can go to after exiting religion isn't as difficult there as it is in America. In America, there's a lot of screaming atheist communities that are very angry. And the reason for that is when a person exits Christianity and they're looking for some kind of community of support, they go to the community that shares the one thing in common, which is their dislike of Christianity or their exit from Christianity. And that's not a positive thing to have in common, because the one thing that binds me together with this other guy in the room is that we both had a negative experience with Christianity. Um, and so this is the perspective we share, and this is the ground this is the only conversations we have, right?
Mm. Yeah.
How about them Blue Jays? No?
No.
Christianity sucks. Yeah. All
Oh
right.
yeah, let's
So,
go.
yeah, exactly. So it's not so much a community of support as it is just sort of a mutual grievance community. Um,
Mm.
and then, the other thing is biographical reconstruction. Now, what this means is that after you have left Christianity, there's this whole chunk of your life. And for most of these people, they grew up in the church. So it was all their life up to this point, um, in which you believed things that you currently do not. So you share very little in common with this person that you were. And so
Mm.
you have to look back and, at this point in your life, you would say, well, I prayed and God moved in my life and this happened. Or, I could feel, I could trace the causal chain of events where this girl dumped me, but then I met a better girl
Mm.
and then I married her and God was in that and so forth. Um, so while you were under that belief system, those things made sense because you saw them from a Christian point of view. Now you're looking back on them and you can no longer take that point of view. You have to explain how you came to believe the things that you believed that are now unbelievable to you. How you sustained the beliefs for so long when it's so clearly untrue.
Mm.
Um, and you have to explain these experiences that you had that at the time they felt very spiritual, but now they couldn't possibly have been spiritual. And so this biographical reconstruction almost inevitably comes to a point where you say, I was lied to. All right. Um, I can't, that's obviously not true. These people deceived me. They gaslighted me. Um, they lied to me. They indoctrinated me,
Yep.
that kind of thing. Now, from a third person point of view, looking in, it's entirely possible that Christianity is wrong, but these people actually believed that their Christianity was true and they were telling you the things they thought were true.
Right.
So they were just earnestly mistaken, not actively deceptive.
Mm.
But during the biographical reconstruction, it's, for whatever reason, tends to be framed in the mind of the deconvert as lies and manipulation
Mm.
and gaslighting, and therefore emotional abuse.
Mm.
Because how else are you going to explain it? Right?
Mm.
You're the hero who's emerged. If I'm to trust my ideas now, if I have to trust my thinking now that this is definitely untrue, then, and I couldn't trust my thinking back then something about me has changed, or my thinking has always been sound, but somebody else was deceiving me. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So I think that the combination between this identity crisis that occurs after you leave religion, this loss of community, which is very traumatic, and then having to try to find another community, because loneliness is like one of the number one killers right now in society.
Hmm.
We need community, we need friends, we need people around us, and when our lives were built around religion and we lose that community, that's
Mm.
pretty traumatic. And then the biographical reconstruction. How do I explain that I used to believe these things? Um, all of that goes together to create the seeds for what we tend to call emotional trauma syndrome. I'm sorry, not emotional, religious trauma syndrome, RTS. Um, Now, I am not saying that is not me saying that the religion never abuses anybody. That
Mm.
nobody ever suffers under the hands of religion. Very clearly, they do. We can find plenty of news stories that say that that's true. What I am saying, however, is that this process of the deconversion crisis that I just outlined probably adds to this perception of religious trauma syndrome
Hmm.
to a degree.
So you're saying it makes it worse for the people that are actually deconverting, or just makes religion look worse in general?
Well, it's, I mean, depends on whose perspective you're looking at it from. You
Right.
know, if I'm not a Christian, but I'm also not a deconvert, and then my friend
Uh-huh.
happens to have deconverted and comes over and tells me how horrible religion was to them, then yeah, it makes a religion look bad.
Hmm.
So it looks bad to the
Interesting.
one or if not to the other.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, question: how much time do you have? I got a couple more questions for you, and, but
Sure, hit
but
me.
if you got to,
I'm
okay, cool.
I'm free.
All right. So yep. So you went through all these different stages, or you used a different word that I forgot what it was called. But um, is there any part of this where, like, a lot of people, like, just, you know, I guess they hop off the trail and they stay becoming a Christian, or is it like, you have these specific set of beliefs, and usually if you get halfway through, you're gonna end up all the way on the other side. Have you noticed any type of pattern there at all?
Well, let me address the second before I do the first, because this is something we've kind of alluded to throughout the
Okay.
conversation, but we haven't gotten into.
Mm-hmm.
There's a process that I've called leftward drift. I might need to find a different name for it, but we'll call it that for now. And that it goes something like this. I have a difficulty with religion, with Christianity. Um, Hold on just a moment. My screen died. All right.
Oh.
All right. I have a problem with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say it's that my church doesn't let women preach. And that seems kind of uncomfortable to me. It doesn't seem fair. And
Okay.
maybe there's, I see the verses that they're coming at me with, but, there might be a different way to look at them. So, I could just leave the church entirely, or I could find a different system of religious belief which
Mm-hmm.
alleviates that problem.
Yep.
So there are plenty of churches out there that allow women to teach, and they have a different way of looking at that. So I could just move to one of those. All right,
Mm-hmm.
fine. I've just moved away from that. Now, bear in mind what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, that you're always comparing your current belief against what you originally believed. All right. So now I'm in this new church and they're letting women preach, and that has settled that issue for me. But this new church now takes a much more relaxed view of scriptural inerrancy than I was used to. So now that becomes a problem, you know.
Yep.
And I have to look back at my original beliefs and then look at this and say, all right, I'll just move a little further to the left. And when I talk about the left, I mean less restrictive, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Right will be code for more restrictive, left will be code for less restrictive. All right. So I have now dumped a lot of my views about scriptural inerrancy, and that's gotten rid of that pressure. Now, women can preach. Scripture doesn't have to be as strict. But then I start thinking about, say, the problem of hell. Hell is a really severe doctrine, and it seems very unfair and very traumatic, if you will, to think about. And so, there's other things out there that say, what we read in the Bible about hell isn't what it is. So I change my mind on that. And when becomes that problem becomes solved, then well, what do you do about the idea of sin? Yeah, and you can see how this works. Every time you've solved a problem by changing your stance, by moving a little to the left, becoming less restrictive, another problem arises because of the move.
Yeah.
Before you made that move, the other thing wasn't the problem, but as soon as you step to a less restrictive, there's another restriction here that you have to cope with. And you continue to do this leapfrog to the left until the entire system of Christianity itself
Mm.
seems restrictive. And why not just dump it entirely? And
Hmm.
I think that's aggravated in our current American culture by politics, because the evangelical church appears to be, if by all accounts of media and so forth, wedded to a particular religion, or I'm sorry, political position.
Okay.
And if that political position becomes objectionable, that political objection has somehow become a theological objection because of the culture.
Yeah.
And so I think this might partially be responsible for a lot of the rapid secularization that you're seeing, is because the country is so politically charged, and there's an unfortunate marriage between evangelical Christianity and particular politics.
Yeah.
So um, leftward drift might move both theologically and politically in that sense. All right. Now, you
Interesting.
had asked, was there a point where a person could kind of rescue the religion, or is there a definite jumping
Yeah.
off point? Obviously, that's going to depend on the person's life circumstance, and in many cases, it's going to depend on what the original religious position of that person had. Because if you grow up Pentecostal and you eventually come to the point of view that, I don't know, being struck by the Spirit or speaking in tongues or one of those sort of common doctrines in Pentecostalism is
Mm.
untrue, or that miraculous healing doesn't happen, something like that, that may be enough right there to cause you to jump ship,
Hmm.
because that was such a strong foundational belief growing up.
Hmm.
Um, the less sort of rigid, uh, the or let me put it this way. This I'll return to the point about intellectual humility. If your church allows you the latitude to believe that I don't know is an appropriate answer to certain questions,
Uh-huh.
that it is possible that you could be wrong about things, and that you're allowed to explore rather than stick to with absolute certainty to uh, specific ideas, specific
Hmm.
doctrines. So dogmatism, I guess, is the word for that. If you're less dogmatic, then I imagine that you have a lot more elbow room to doubt, to question, to change your mind without jumping ship. So the more rigid your starting point, the more likely you are to jump ship in the face of doubts.
Hmm.
And that's why I would say, if there was anything that could possibly rescue religion in the West, it would be a return to intellectual humility, which is the idea that I am just one person. I'm a small human being with a limited mind. I can't know everything, and it's possible that I'm wrong about things, but not knowing the answer to a religious objection doesn't mean that there is no answer. It just
Hmm.
means that I'm limited in my ability to understand things.
Yeah. That's kind of crazy. That's really really interesting. Okay, so this is kind of similar to the situation. So you have the origins debate, and uh, I'm sure you're familiar that in a lot of circles, someone like Ken Hammer enters in Genesis. Maybe not doesn't say like, "Hey, you can't be a Christian and be an evolutionist or an old
Mm-hmm.
earther or whatever," but
Mm-hmm.
it's basically portrayed like you can't. And I just did a video on the topic where, like, there's a lot of like subliminal messaging, like the book of one of Ken Ham's first books literally has a snake and then an apple, and that apple has evolution written on it. And it's like there's this, like, almost an idea like, oh, evolution bad, and
Mm-hmm.
young earth creationism good. We have to stay with young earth creationism almost. It's not specifically ever said, but it's heavily implied. So, question for you, like, I mean, you've kind of talked in your channel about like how young earth creationism and the origins of it, you don't know like how often people deconvert because of that. But like, that seems like a very core, like very important idea, that if like evolution is bad. So, and those kinds of circles that you see that, and I mean, does that ever come up in these discussions of deconverting? And does is that just like, not very important, or does, like, do you actually see that people that are in these circles oftentimes have, leave a lot easier because of something like that? Any ideas?
Well, I would say that evolution definitely is one of these recurring themes that you see in terms of why people choose to leave
Uh-huh.
religion. So Again and again, it's one of these things where the church itself, your religious environment, gives you a binary choice. Either um, Christianity is true or evolution is true, but not both. You know, and so
Hmm.
if evolution starts to look a little reasonable, it calls the truth of Christianity into place. It doesn't give option for a third ground for maybe both and, but rather it's either or. I'm looking at a graph that I put formed
Okay,
for
take your time.
the frequency of, here you go, creationism. So okay, so I would say creationism is in the third tier of objection of meaning that from the most objectionable thing that you'll hear, which is scriptural inerrancy. That's by far that's the first tier, and then the second most, which would be the sexual ethics of the church, um, and then in the third tier would be creationism. And when I say tier, I'm talking about the frequency with which people talked about it in their deconversion stories.
Hmm.
So if it was never mentioned, it's pretty low on the thing. If it was mentioned by, so, and people, when they tell their deconversion story, they don't say, I had one objection at full stop. They'll raise
Yeah.
a lot of objections. And so when I rated frequency, I was just seeing how often that came up in the various
Hmm.
deconversion stories.
Hmm.
And creationism is up there. Um, So again, and this is one of those things, if their church had never told them that either evolution is true or Christianity is true, but they can't coexist, then they probably would not have voiced that as an objection leading to deconversion, which is not to say they wouldn't have deconverted, but that wouldn't have been a factor in the deconversion.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so um, yeah, what percentage of people who are deconverting note that they, felt lied to, that is a reason they originally started the deconversion process? Like you kind of talked about how it's like an after thing, but that you don't, I mean, do you ever hear about that like in the deconversion process? Is that just super rare?
That they were lied to?
Yeah, they feel lied to, and like that's why they're leaving Christianity, and or that's why they started the deconversion process and all that.
I could see a person saying that. Okay, well, yeah, here's a good one. Julia Sweeney, who's a comedian who tells her deconversion story.
Okay.
She was Catholic. She was raised Catholic, and she it was told a story about how she was sitting on her couch one day as a teenager, and some Mormon missionaries came by, and so started talking to them, or rather, they started talking to her, and they started telling her about all these crazy Mormon doctrines that seemed ridiculous to her. And so, after they left, she was sitting there chuckling at some of the things that they had told her, and then she started
Mm-hmm.
comparing them to the things she'd been told, things like the virgin birth and talking snakes and various things. And these were things that were taken as uh, fact,
Mm-hmm.
but when you listen to a religion from the outside, and this is the outsider test of faith. I'm trying to remember the
Mm-hmm.
name of the guy who did that. Oh well. Anyway, the outsider's test. Basically, you take a look at your own beliefs from the outside and see how ridiculous they are, and that's what she started to do, and that's the point at which she felt deceived. I don't know if she ever thought that no, her parents did lie to her. They lied to her
Oh.
about her zodiac sign. Uh, and
What?
so, yeah, because her mother wanted to get her into school earlier, and so they changed her birth date on the records, and so she was a different zodiac sign than she actually was. And so she was like, and I kept up with my zodiac, and it was always so me. And then I found out I was a different sign, and I went out and I looked at that, and it was so me. And then I realized, oh, I was just reading myself into that, which
Yeah,
again was another
sure.
step. But I mean, you could see the same thing with like Santa Claus or something like that, where you see your religious parents tell you a thing which they know isn't true, and it's a lie, and then you connect that with the idea of God. But for the most part, when I see this, I was being lied to. it's usually from this idea of I looked back at my life as a Christian and realized I'd been lied to.
Mm.
It wasn't like I found out I was being lied to one day and I started questioning my faith.
Yeah.
It's
Mm.
in reverse or in
Yeah.
retrospect.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay. All right. That's all I got for you. It's been a absolute pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, I've enjoyed
Any
it.
last thoughts? Anything you want to add, and maybe shout out to your channel and your where you post and where
Sure.
more people can find you.
Yeah, so my research is posted through my various channels. I've got a Facebook page called Switching Sides. I have a Twitter. My Twitter is at Sides Switching, um, with two S, Sides Switching. And then my YouTube channel is Switching Sides. And my
Very cool.
Patheos blog is Switching Sides. So pretty
Awesome.
much just Switching Sides. Joel Furches. You'll find me.
There you go. Great. Yeah. Right. Yeah, because you're the only one.
Yep.
So, all right. Awesome. Yeah, it's been pleasure, absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks for coming
I've
on
enjoyed
here.
it.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, thank
And
you.
yeah, sure. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
You too.
Awesome.
All right. Bye.